Did you know that the human brain experiences a measurable increase in activity during extended periods of darkness? In winter, prolonged nights can alter sleep patterns and induce vivid dreams or even hallucinations. These psychological changes are amplified in isolation, making the season a breeding ground for unexplainable phenomena. Welcome to episode 7 of Shadows of the Mind, our Christmas special, where we delve into the chilling intersection of winter's isolation and fear. If you're new here, explore our series playlist to uncover the mysteries and connections leading up to this moment. Jacob staggered through the blizzard, his breath visible in the frigid air. The forest stretched endlessly, silent except for the faint whispers that seemed to emerge from the trees. The journal he had burned in the church was gone, but its words were seared into his mind, replaying in an endless loop. You invited me in. You are the key. As the storm began to clear, he spotted a dark silhouette in the distance. It looked like a structure, its faint outline barely discernible through the falling snow. At first, Jacob thought it was a small, derelict cabin, perhaps a place to shelter for the night. But as he drew closer, the building loomed larger than he had imagined, its proportions too vast for anything so modest. An old, crumbling mansion rose before him, its frost-covered windows reflecting the moonlight like hollow, watching eyes. His legs felt leaden as he climbed the frozen steps to the door, which creaked open as if expecting him. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the frost forming intricate patterns on the walls. Snow had blown through shattered windows, covering the grand staircase and the cracked wooden floors. A massive chandelier hung above, its crystals shimmering faintly. Jacob's flashlight beam swept across the space, landing on a large mirror mounted on the wall. But what he saw wasn't his own reflection. The image was hollow-eyed and smiling. Jacob turned away, unease gnawing at him, and moved deeper into the mansion. Each creak of the floorboards echoed unnaturally, stretching into a haunting symphony of isolation. His flashlight illuminated faint tracks in the dust. Others had been here recently. Or were they still here? As he wandered, he found himself in a parlor decorated with wilted holly wreaths and faded Christmas garlands. A skeletal tree stood in the corner, its ornaments cracked and dulled with age. A music box sat on a dusty table, playing a warped version of Silent Night. Jacob stopped, his breath catching. Someone or something had set the scene, but for whom? Elias tightened his coat against the biting wind as he trudged through the snow, his boots sinking into the icy ground. He had abandoned his car miles ago when the storm made the roads impassable. The shard in his pocket pulsed faintly, its warmth unnerving but insistent, like a heartbeat guiding him forward. Memories of the Watcher's house gnawed at him, each step bringing back the suffocating darkness and the chilling whispers. But this time was different. The voices weren't confined to shadows. They followed him, weaving through the storm like threads of smoke. As he walked, he noticed something new, a slight twitch in his hand. It started faint, barely noticeable, but it grew more pronounced with every step he took toward the mansion. His fingers flexed involuntarily, the motion sharp and unnatural, as though his body were reacting to the shard in his pocket. What the hell? Elias muttered, clenching his fist to steady the motion. But the twitching persisted, an eerie accompaniment to the whispers in his head. It was as if the shard's energy was seeping into him, changing him in ways he couldn't understand. He reached the edge of a frozen river and stopped. The shard in his pocket vibrated violently, almost as if warning him. He hesitated, scanning the area with his flashlight. The beam landed on a set of footprints leading to the other side. Fresh footprints. The path led him to an iron gate, its surface encased in frost. Beyond it stood the same mansion Jacob had entered. Elias hesitated, his flashlight illuminating the faint glow of the windows. A wreath hung crookedly on the front door, its ribbons tattered and blowing in the wind. He wasn't alone. The mansion's icy halls seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn revealing more of its decayed grandeur. Jacob's flashlight flickered, the batteries weakening as he moved deeper into the labyrinth. Every mirror he passed reflected something different. One showed him as a boy, his face tear-streaked and frightened. Another displayed him standing still while his reflection moved. A third revealed a woman he didn't recognize, her face twisted in anguish. As Jacob stared at the mirrors, one began to ripple. Instead of his reflection, it showed a scene he recognized. A dimly lit kitchen from his childhood. The image pulled him in, and suddenly, he was there. Jacob was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table. His father's voice boomed as he slammed a bottle onto the counter. "You're just like your mother, weak!" Young Jacob flinched, tears welling up in his eyes. His mother sat silently, her face pale and worn. The tension in the room was suffocating. The memory unfolded with brutal clarity, showing every detail he had tried to bury. "You'll never amount to anything," his father sneered, pointing a finger at him. Jacob's small hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. The shame and fear from that night still lingered in his bones. The reflection in the mirror shifted, showing Jacob's adult face, tear-streaked and frightened, just like in the memory. He stepped back, his heart pounding. The mirror returned to its original form, but the scars of the memory stayed with him. Jacob felt the floor beneath him give way, and he fell into darkness. When he landed, he found himself in a circular room lined entirely with mirrors. The air was frigid, biting into his skin even through his coat, and the faint hum of an unseen energy filled the space. Each mirror was unique in its design, yet all were tarnished, their frames ornate but cracked. Some had ivy etched into their borders, while others were chipped, their gilded edges flaking off. The light in the room came from no discernible source. A pale, cold glow that seemed to emanate from the mirrors themselves. The walls between them appeared seamless, as if the room had no beginning or end. Jacob's breath fogged the air as he stepped cautiously forward, the crunch of his boots on the frost-covered floor echoing unnaturally. The reflections in the mirrors weren't just images. They moved independently of him, their faces contorted into expressions of fear, anger, or despair. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay a shard of glass. The shard glowed faintly, pulsating as if it were alive. Jacob approached it, and as he drew nearer, the whispers coalesced into a single, eerie voice. "To understand fear, you must become it." The reflections in the mirrors began to ripple, their surfaces shimmering like disturbed water. Slowly the figures stepped out, their distorted forms materializing into the room. They surrounded him, their faces eerily familiar. Each one murmured fragments of his past, their voices weaving a haunting tapestry of his darkest memories. Jacob recognized moments he wished to forget. The argument with his father that drove him to leave home, the night he ignored a friend's call for help, the cold loneliness of the years that followed. The reflections weren't just showing him his past. They were reliving it, forcing him to confront every choice, every regret. "Why are you showing me this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they moved closer, their presence suffocating. Jacob reached for the shard, his hand trembling, and as his fingers brushed its surface, a blinding light erupted, consuming the room in a deafening silence. Elias burst through the door, his gun raised, and instantly felt the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on him. The room was circular and disorienting, its mirrored walls reflecting his image back at him from every angle. Yet, something about those reflections was wrong. They seemed sharper, darker, their eyes hollow as if mocking him. He hesitated at the threshold, his breath quick and shallow. His hand twitched uncontrollably at his side, the involuntary motion now a persistent reminder of how far this nightmare had invaded his body. He clenched his fist, trying to suppress it, but the effort only added to his frustration. The room was freezing, colder than any place he had ever been, and the frost on the floor cracked under his boots as he stepped forward. The mirrors reflected a fragmented version of himself. One mirror showed him as a child, wide-eyed and innocent, while another revealed his grizzled face streaked with sweat and exhaustion. But one reflection, just slightly to his left, didn't follow his movements. It stood motionless, staring directly at him with a grim smile. "Jacob!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally in the room. His words sounded distant, as though the space absorbed them before they could return. He spotted Jacob near the center, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of a pedestal. But Jacob wasn't moving. His back was to Elias and his posture was rigid, his head tilted slightly as if listening. Elias felt a pang of fear. "Jacob," he called again, his tone sharper. His steps were slow and deliberate as he approached, each one feeling heavier than the last. The twitch in his hand grew worse, his fingers jerking spasmodically. He tucked the hand into his coat pocket, trying to hide it from himself as much as from the room. "Control it. Don't let it control you." As he got closer, he could feel the cold intensify, the air thick with an almost electric charge. The mirrors seemed to hum faintly, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Elias's reflection moved erratically now, flickering in and out like a poorly tuned signal. When he was just a few steps away from Jacob, Elias stopped. The pedestal came into view, and atop it sat a shard of glass, glowing faintly. The same shard in his pocket pulsed in rhythm with the one on the pedestal, and he could feel it through his coat like a heartbeat against his chest. "Jacob," Elias said softly, reaching out with his unsteady hand. Jacob turned slowly, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered. Elias followed Jacob's gaze to the mirrors. Figures were emerging from their shimmering surfaces, shadowy forms that solidified as they stepped into the room. Their faces were twisted versions of Elias and Jacob, grotesque parodies that bore scars and expressions of rage, sorrow, and malice. "Get back," Elias shouted, raising his gun. The shadows didn't flinch. They advanced slowly, their whispers growing louder until they became an overwhelming roar. The voices were disjointed and personal, each one hitting a nerve Elias didn't know was exposed. "Failure. Coward. You let her die." Elias's knees almost buckled at the sound of the last phrase. His sister's face flashed in his mind, a memory he had buried deep. The day she called him for help, and he didn't answer. The guilt surged through him, tangible and suffocating. He tightened his grip on the gun, his hand trembling uncontrollably. "Shut up!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The reflections didn't stop. They stepped closer, their whispers stabbing at his most vulnerable memories. He could feel the room closing in on him, the cold biting into his skin and seeping into his bones. "Elias." Jacob's voice broke through the chaos, desperate and sharp. "The shard. Do something." Elias tore his gaze away from the advancing figures and looked at the shard in his pocket. It was blazing now, a searing heat that burned against his chest. With a shout of frustration, he pulled it out and held it aloft. The room erupted in light, the mirrors shattering one by one. The reflections screamed as they dissolved into smoke, their cries echoing long after they had vanished. The shard in Elias's hand cooled instantly, its glow fading to a dim pulse. Jacob sank to his knees, breathing heavily. Elias stood frozen, his hands still twitching, the weight of the experience crashing down on him. "What the hell just happened?" Jacob asked, his voice barely audible. Elias didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the shard, and for the first time he felt something beyond fear. It was curiosity, a terrifying, consuming curiosity about what the shard was and what it wanted from them. Fear isn't just in the mind. It's in the choices we make, the reflections we avoid, and the truths we can't escape. Jacob and Elias's journey has led them deeper into the Watcher's design. But the questions remain. Who is the Watcher, and what does it want? Join us for the next chapter of Shadows of the Mind, and remember to like, subscribe, and explore the full series playlist for every chilling detail.